Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
In this conversation, we talk about the way in which community shapes practice and how that practice always arises in community. This is something developed in the Yale School, taken up in the theology of James McClendon, who in his trilogy describes then these communities of practice. This, of course, is the work of Stanley Hauerwas and John Howard Yoder. But even as we talk about somebody like Yoder, and of course the failed communities of practice or failed practices, it may be that in failed practices there is a reflection of inadequate understanding. Not to lay too heavy of an emphasis upon that, but the idea is that two things have to be thought of in conjunction, even in doctrines that can be as obscure as the Trinity. These doctrines then should give rise to a particular set of practices. If they don't, I think we need to be suspicious that we've perhaps gotten something wrong. This is our continuation of our class on religion and the way that in religion very often the two things get separated, faith and practice. That's certainly true of religions in the world, and the way that we often view religion in general through Christianity, that is a kind of mistaken understanding. If you enjoy these conversations and would like to participate in Forging Plowshares, we would encourage you to take a class through Plowshares Bible Institute, to join a book club. We've got a men's book club that's going to come up. If you are able to donate, we encourage you to do that. You can see how to do that through Outreach International on our website. Certainly, we appreciate your liking us on social media, and we always want to hear from people. If you've got a response or you've got an idea or you want to share something, don't hesitate to reach out through the website or through contacting me personally. I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hi, Paul.
Everything good?
Yeah, well, almost. I was disappointed with the Super Bowl outcome yesterday.
Oh, I thought it was perfect.
Yeah, of course. You're part of the world. I'm a West Coaster.
I honestly don't normally watch football, but I did tune into that one.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I thought it was kind of a mediocre game kind of till the very end. Actually, it got exciting because of the tie.
Yeah, that made it exciting.
I like high-scoring blowouts, 47-48 or something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty low score. Not much happening for a lot of the game. Simon, how you doing? Good to see you.
Good, thanks. Nice to see you all.
Simon.
We immediately got into depressing subjects here. Did you have any questions about last week?
You presented the established three ways of relating religions together, and then this fourth way that considers the embedded nature of religions with particular reference to the Christian faith, how it works out, in practical form of life. I haven't quite thought out how this fourth way is like simply a fourth way that functionally is equivalent to the other three ways. Okay, what I mean is this. Is this fourth way not just another version of exclusivism? If what is, recognizably Christian is determined by a particular set of practices, or actually a particular form of life, then that would seem to make the Christian faith, and in fact every other religion, exclusive of the others, because the form of life is specific to that particular religion. So I'm just struggling with this, the old form of exclusivism and this new form that might be exclusivism as well.
I like your question, and it's a penetrating question, and maybe getting to a kind of, is there a complete consistency in what's being said? And let me say that I'm actually working with two parameters that I'm not sure I can completely put together, but I believe in them. And one is I do believe in the universality of Christianity. And what I mean by that, Sergei Bulgakov, he certainly believes in that we're saved in and through Christ. And I believe that. Is that a form of exclusivism? Well, inasmuch as that unless you put on the particular practices that we're called to in Christ, and this, of course, would be inclusive even as I would take it, most of the warnings, the sheep and the goats, those warnings are not actually given to non-Christians, to some class of pagans somewhere. Those warnings are all to Christians. So, have we put on the practices? And that's the question in those judgment scenes. So I believe that God is working with all people everywhere in and through Jesus Christ, and that Christ is the cosmic Christ, that creation in the terms of Maximus is incarnation. On the other hand, I can't lay that out. I can't say, in other words, I think that there's a mysterious element to that we may not be able to always identify, but I think that part of what is happening, this is partly the value of the experience of God that Hart, is laying out. That there is a universality to it. Of course, Hart, and I think that Hart is actually, I think he would say what I'm saying now, though he doesn't say it in the book. But nonetheless, God is accomplishing these universal purposes in and through the historical person, Jesus Christ. I believe in a universal salvation. I think that's what the Bible teaches. But I also believe that salvation is not some abstract, ambiguous thing on the order of John Hick. John Hick kind of just flattens out everybody and makes of religion a kind of abstraction. Oh, that's making people better or more loving. On the other hand, I'm not doing a Reinhold Niebuhr thing that there's anonymous Christians. Now that a little bit, in other words, I don't think a fully anonymous Christian. Are there people that are, in fact, doing things that Christ calls us to, and they may not be aware of it? Oh, sure. And in fact, this is the rule of the cross that I think we can lay down, the idea that a man would lay down his life for another. Is that something that only people who claim the name of Christ do? I think you can find that in other people and places, but people do need to come to know the historical person of Jesus Christ and put on the specific set of practices. So I'm saying two things that I may not quite be able to fit together. I'm making salvation a practical salvation in terms of both Christianity and other religions. This is partly, I don't know if you caught this with what Trent was saying. Much of religion, like Buddhism, when you actually encounter Buddhism, the abstractions that we have, the kind of the theoretical teachings about Buddhism, they really don't mean much, because Thai Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, different forms of Buddhism are so different on the ground that to even call them to say they're the same religion. And I know what you're going to say, Tim.
What am I going to say?
You're going to say, well, isn't that true of Christianity?
No, actually, that's a good one. No, I was actually going to say, though, isn't there even the question that some talk about Buddhism almost as just being a philosophical movement? You know what I mean? That's my thought.
There is a philosophical Buddhism. In other words, the kind that we all kind of enjoy reading about in Japan, the Kyoto School of Philosophy, Kitaro Nishida. He in fact, makes of Zen Buddhism a kind of philosophical movement. This is what Martin Heidegger is going to pick up on. But do you think that a practitioner of Buddhism in Japan has any notion of that philosophical understanding? Highly doubtful. So the practitioner is coming and doing He's practicing the religion to accomplish specific purposes. And so between philosophical Buddhism, which may come with practices of meditation or whatever, that's a very different thing than the Buddhism you're going to encounter in a Buddhist temple.
But the interesting thing there, what you were going to put the words into my mouth about the diversity within the Christian faith, but in a sense, there is this entire philosophical sense of the Christian faith. Like when you think about, just for instance, the doctrine of the Trinity, 85% of the people on the street don't even know the word homoousios or all of this language that we love to play with. And to me, it's a lot of sophistry, because at the end of the day, it is this part where you talk about the practice, what's going on the ground. How are you treating people? How are you picking up these practices? I really have a hard time believing that when people get to the Peter at the gate, there's going to be a quiz and making sure that the economic Trinity versus the, so we also have that same tradition that people get so wound up with. And, I can't fellowship with you because you baptize babies. And no, it's adult baptism. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
Yes, us good Baptists. Yes, that's the point. And of course, what we believe is that there should be a coinciding between faith and practice. And partly what my understanding of right doctrine is, that right doctrine then gives rise to correct practice. Can we say what correct practice is? What is that? Well, it is a community. And by the way, Jim, this comes from Hannah Arendt. I think Hannah Arendt gives us a good description of the goals of Christianity. That is, that she distinguishes between violence and power. And of course, real power in her estimate is a community of love, a communion, which I think is the practice that we're aiming at in Christian doctrine and practice, that there is a communion of love in which there is not the exercise of a coercive kind of violence. Normally we would call power. She's saying actually the way that what we normally think about power is not power at all, and that is a kind of, top down. Also, C.S. Lewis is surprisingly quite good on this. I think C.S. Lewis had a kind of an abhorrence of the master-servant understanding, probably because he worked in the university so long, because universities are so filled with politics, and maybe it's just any of us that are involved in human organizations, the guy that gets a little power, what they think of as power. In other words, what's the use to having a position if you can't coercively strong-arm other people? Lewis had a picture in That Hideous Strength. Have you ever read that? It's a kind of wonderful novel about, it's this little college in which the whole thing is this hierarchy, a kind of fascist hierarchy, and in the middle of it is this brain in a vat. At the time, actually, I was going through my own struggles with a little college that reminded me of Lewis's That Hideous Strength. I thought, oh, he's captured the very place where I work, There should be a coincidence of community practices and doctrine. And of course, sometimes I don't know that we can locate that. But for example, on the doctrine of the Trinity, doesn't our doctrine of the Trinity, doesn't that translate into a set of practices with other people in our own prayer practices, meditation practices, our attitudes with other people that reinforces a self-giving, sacrificial love? If it doesn't, I'm not sure why it matters.
One other thing, when Simon was speaking, he was just mentioning that set of practices and form of life. And that made me think of, have you done any, like in this course, anything about George Lindbeck's The Nature of Doctrine? Because that sounded like his language, Simon. Have you run across his book?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Have you, Paul?
Yeah, I know about. Tell Simon about Lindbeck.
I don't, you know what? I pulled it out when we started this course. Well, it was written, I think, in I want to say maybe the 80s. It's called The Nature of Doctrine, but I think it's got religion and practice, and it was basically this kind of the start of post-liberalism. Kind of trying to move beyond liberal theology, but at the same time not end up embracing evangelicalism, that kind of thing. So it kind of became a third way, and I mean, in a way, it sort of is. Am I wrong about this? But maybe it kind of got picked up by some of the radical orthodoxy or some of that. Is Lindbeck kind of popular there? Or because when you mentioned James, the narrative theology people, Hauerwas
Yes,
and McClendon.
Hauerwas, McClendon are all coming out of the Yale School. Lindbeck was at Yale.
Right. And so, yeah, because I tried to read it when I started reading for this course, just to kind of find a bit of an intersection there, because he uses the word religion as well. And as usual, every time I walk away from our class each week, Paul, I'm just more confused than I was the week before. So obviously it's working.
I'm doing my job.
Yeah. Exactly.
No, that's spot on, Tim, is to bring up Lindbeck, the Yale School, because James McClendon, he's passed away now, but he wrote everybody writes a trilogy, on doctrine, but he orders his trilogy in a different fashion, and he writes ethics first. And the reason he's writing ethics first is because usually what happens in a theology course, you have 3 parts: doctrine of God, that you go through the various doctrines, and usually ethics is left to the end, and then you never get to it. And you never learn how doctrine and ethics are supposed to intersect. And of course, he's not doing it just for those purposes, but he's doing it to say that the whole thing is about ethics, is about practice. And he's doing this very much in the spirit of the Yale School, very much in the spirit of Lindbeck, and in conversation with Lindbeck and Hauerwas, that group of people that were at Yale. And so they're calling it post-liberalism. It's a kind of post-liberalism, post-fundamentalism. It's a passage beyond both, I think, in that what is being missed is this understanding. So he begins with ethics, and he begins with a narrative theology. He's going to try to write a narrative theology. And what he does in ethics, a lot of what he does in ethics is the first volume, and witness is the last volume. Doctrine is, in fact, the middle volume. Doctrine contains usually what we think of when you're writing a theology. But in ethics, he's telling stories a lot. He's saying we cannot do this thing apart from a narrative understanding of who people are. We understand things through the narrative, through the story. Now, he kind of, in doctrine, and he consciously is aware he fails in his project to carry it all the way through in doctrine. But by the time he gets to witness, he's doing the same thing. A key person in witness, just think of Lindbeck, think of the Yale School, think of what they're talking about. Who are these guys especially? What philosopher are they especially interested in?
Oh, I was thinking of Hans Frey, but Paul Ricoeur?
Well, Ricoeur is there, but Ludwig Wittgenstein. Why Wittgenstein? Because he does for us and by the way, Hauerwas doesn't talk about this much in his usual writings, but underneath he'll say that Wittgenstein is a key influence. You're familiar with what I'm talking about here. Why Wittgenstein?
Yeah, if you can just give us a quick recap of the Wittgenstein's relevant idea.
It's actually quite simple. There's nothing complicated, I think, in Wittgenstein. And that is the usual way that we think about language is, in fact, that language is this thing that occurs in our head. And Wittgenstein is going to say, no, language is an embodied, that you're enculturated into it. You're embodied, what I'm doing right now, obviously. And of course, what he means by body is it's a community, it's a communion, that you don't learn language privately. And so Wittgenstein is writing against the notion of a private language. Augustine, when he's describing how he learned language, he said, when I was a child, I had my own language, and what I had to do, I would watch my parents, and if they would, point at a cup and say cup, then I would translate from out of my language into their language. In other words, he thought that we're all born with, little kids are born with a language, they just have to learn to translate. That is not true at any level. Does a child know what a cup is before they have the word cup? Does a child know what anything is? In other words, we're talking about language acquisition. The world opens up to us bodily and linguistically simultaneously. The other person, of course, that Wittgenstein is standing over and against is René Descartes, because René Descartes is doing the same thing. He's picturing what's happening in our head as disembodied. I think, therefore I am. And what he means by thinking, we were just talking about C.S. Lewis and the mind in the vat. That's the Cartesian picture of what a human being really is. Our bodies, you guys remember the movie Men in Black? And there's a scene in Men in Black, and the jewelers, they're sitting in a restaurant and having this conversation. The monster comes in and shoots one of them, and his head pops open, and there's three little green men in there running he's not a Jewish jeweler at all. It's these little green men, the ghost in the machine. That's kind of an illustration of the way that in a Cartesian understanding, people looked at the relationship between the mind and the body. That, the mind is the little ghost, the ghost in the machine. Descartes literally thought that. He thought of the body as mere mechanics, and the mind then as separate from those mechanics and the thing that runs the mechanic. What Wittgenstein is doing is, and I think his whole project, he begins, of course, he doesn't see this in the Tractatus. He's still working in a kind of dualism in the Tractatus. But by the time he gets to the philosophical investigations, he's combating this kind of ghost in the machine imagery, in which, no, we're not language users apart from being parts of communities of practice. We could even say that language is a set of practices, right?
What, Paul, I'm just going to interject. What's really interesting is this, and again, I was probably reading from a year and a half ago, where I read a number of very fascinating books written by linguists and stuff, in sort of anthropology of language and that. And one of them is actually a fascinating, I may have even introduced you to him, but he was an ex-Wycliffe missionary who lost his faith, but he's now a very well-known linguist. I think he's out of University of Florida or something. And again, picking up a lot of this. And as now you're kind of goading me to want to go back and revisit that kind of with your idea here of Wittgenstein. But also tied into that is the very famous word, the neologism that René Girard invented, which was interdividual. There's no such thing as just a single person. We're all part of one another, this whole web of connectedness. And I see now how you're tying that all back into the narrative and everything. And this pushes against very much the tradition we grew up in, because so much of what I was taught is it's your intellectual, it's that intellectual assent to this set of doctrines. If you don't believe, your practice is irrelevant. You've got to believe the right things, and this still continues very much to this day. So you can be the meanest, grumpiest, ogre, horrible person, but at least you've got your ducks in a row theologically in terms of your beliefs, which is just a travesty.
Maybe your doctrines enable you to be a mean ogre because your soul's saved. and so you got that taken care of. This is kind of Zizek's view of the way that religion functions for people. He pictures, the Wall Street, the guy that's kind of cruelly oppressing other people. But in the morning, he may do his Zen meditative practices, because that then makes him a more efficient capitalist. Isn't that the way that Christianity gets practiced? Oh, that Christianity enables us to be better capitalists, better citizens. Christianity is then at the service of the state or of capitalism or what is considered these outward purposes. Whereas, you got your soul's going to heaven, so you can kind of set that aside and forget about it.
Right. And of course, for you, Paul, though, you've got the practice, being a good Christian would then mean voting Republican.
Yeah. I think this is the Trump phenomenon. I think this is the way that evangelicalism is functioning. Here is this obscene individual. He is in a Zizekian frame. Trump is the embodiment of the obscene superego. Why have conservative evangelicals latched onto this guy? I always think about, this is terrible. You got me off into obscenities here. Jerry Falwell and Jerry Falwell Jr. In other words, Jerry Falwell Jr., his father, the moral majority, the superego figure. And then Jerry Falwell Jr., he enjoys watching his wife have sex with other men. I know this is bizarre stuff, but this is the way Freud pictures the superego functioning, or Zizek and Lacan. That is, in some way, in this kind of perverse understanding, you're giving pleasure to the obscene superego figure. And I always think of Trump. Oh, here he's the perfect embodiment of this obscene figure. He just breaks all the laws, he grabs the women. His language is vulgar. And yet the more he does it, the more people are enchanted with him. And so I think it is precisely this divide. It's a divide within the law. There is the obscene superego figure, the embodiment of the law. Or in Freudian terms, if you think of, do you know the primal horde? Freud's theory of the primal horde. It's a complete myth, but it illustrates some point. What is the original situation in which the law arises? What is one law that all people share? All peoples everywhere. Bans on incest, incestuous relations. And so Freud proposes that in the original horde, and he tells this like it's history, the father figure was taking all the women for himself. And the sons had no wives, they had no women. And so how do the sons get access to the women? Well, they kill the father, and being primitives, they eat him, taking both the father unto themselves and then setting up the relationship between the sacred and the profane. That is, that the father figure is both here is the moment in which the law is enacted. What law? The law against incest. And of course, their father is simultaneously the one who embodies that law and transgresses that law. Think of the king, the figure of a king. Can a king in a traditional society, this was the difference that Jewish society was supposed to make. Can a king break the law? He can't break the law because he is the law. The king is the law. This is why it's so unusual, when Nathan comes into David and accuses him of adultery and murder. Because usually the king, the king does whatever the king wants to do. So, I think that there is this, in my understanding, we're always dealing with this structure of a kind of obscene, superego, legal figure that we project upon God. In other words, God is the ultimate obscenity, I think, in most people's, I know that sounds terrible, but in most people's religion, he's the punishing father figure. But of course, it has nothing to do with Christianity, but this is the form that Christianity has taken. And I think this is why evangelicalism has embraced this obscene figure in the way that they have.
And that's why a couple of weeks ago, Brian Zahn tweeted out, evangelicalism is an unreached people group.
I like it. I like it. And maybe unreachable, because it's a people group that is so entrenched in their religion, and they don't have Christianity to save them. They can't hear the good news because the good news has already been perverted for them. I mean, it's a terrible thing. And I don't say that lightly, but you understand, people are suffering as a result of this belief system. People suffer mentally, and they suffer socially. They suffer in the family because, we've embraced the notion of a kind of patriarchal father figure as being God's ordained system. We've embraced the notion of the nation state and a kind of religion that is obsequious to the state. Church-state divide is supposedly in this country the way it works. But of course, what happens is the religion is given the realm of the spiritual, and what is meant by the spiritual is in your head, private, and having nothing to do with a set of practices. And therefore, Christianity is made the servant of the state. Or if you want to say it in the worst way, Christianity is made the servant of the law. In other words, that's what penal substitution, divine satisfaction. It is just a servitude of a reification of the law. And this reification, this is the idolatry that we're continually trying to penetrate.
I've seen a couple billboards, red, white, and blue, God, guns, and country, 50 feet long and 30 feet tall.
I don't know where you are, Jim, but I'm in the middle of this thing in Missouri. I'm surrounded by Trumpism, by the right-wing racist rhetoric. I live in a place that has maintained the name Little Dixie, Dixie from the Confederacy, pro-South. I was surprised just last week, the people in my little church, they said, oh yeah, in our little town, we had laws against black people being there beyond dusk. They weren't written laws, but sundown laws, no black people after sundown. The Christianity is, of course, I would like to think it's not this, but I'm afraid that so much of it is either rendered supportive or at a minimum is rendered silent in the face of these things.
Trent mentioned something. His connections over there in Western Mass are precious and vital, but I didn't get the sense that he was in a thriving community he had a strong sense of faith and a strong identity, but the culture wasn't allowing that to thrive.
I think he was describing a consortium of people, which the InterVarsity Press was at the center of that. Normally in this country, we could kind of have fellowship with a wide range of people, and the political thing was just kind of there. But I think it's become such a front and center thing for many evangelicals that if you're not pro-Trump, I know this sounds strange, Simon, where you're coming, you guys that aren't in the middle of this, you're written off as something dangerous. This is not a time that we can be silent in church. It would be the equivalent of being silent in church during the rise of Adolf Hitler. But of course, I think most people, if you're a young preacher at a big church, you're just not going to do it. You're not going to risk it, even if you may think maybe you really aren't a lover of Trump. But you can't afford to say it because you'll get fired immediately.
But some of the same dynamics become part of the conversation when I've had conversations with folks on the other side.
It can.
I feel I haven't learned to walk that boundary. I can't think of any friend that I can be on that boundary and still connect to some of these things that we've been talking about the last couple of years. The un-Trumpians and the Trumpians, it's either you have to choose which shadow you're going to come under or against.
That's what we're up against. And I think the thing I'm trying to that we need to grasp, and I think this week, a kind of practical view. Let me give you a definition and see if you agree with my definition about what Christianity is, what the gospel is. The gospel is liberation from bondage. And bondage is constituted by a human construct. In other words, I'm covering all bases here. A human construct, maybe a secondary reality that is taken as primary, a nothing that is made into something. And liberation occurs through being joined to God in Christ. And this liberating work is taking place universally. So I'm doing two things. I'm putting into place, what Sergei Bulgakov is picturing as the work of Christ, that there is the first Adam and there is the second Adam. We can describe the first Adam in terms of this bondage. We kind of just do the same thing in different areas, talking about the reification of the law. And the law might be any number of forms. But we can describe this in real world practical terms. This gets tricky with secularism and modernity, right? In other words, I don't think this is a realm apart from what I've just said. That secularism, modernity, is mythologizing, animating a kind of what is inherently, or making an existent out of what is a non-existent force. We're attributing to culture, modern culture. Modernity just arises. There is a kind of scientism. It's the same thing. We're reifying the modern in the same way. It's functioning in the same way that mythology always works. It makes animate that which has no will or is not a operative force in reality.
Yeah, isn't that what Paul referred to as the principalities and the powers?
Absolutely. And I think that the principalities and powers are universal. We're always working with the principalities and powers.
Being joined to God in Christ takes place in community.
Yes. It is a set of practices. In other words, it's not something you do in your head.
Right.
Now, I know, Tim, and I'm completely empathetic. Where is this community? Sometimes I can't answer. And sometimes we have to find community where we can. I'm afraid that the churches that we may be surrounded with are so corrupted that we can't find community. Maybe you can. I don't know. It is a communal thing. Maybe this is your community. I think that's fine. I don't think we can do this on our own.
Well, it's the famous saw, we're always standing on the shoulders of giants. To seeing a little more. And I think what we've got though now with this technology of the interweb is the phenomenal ability to be in touch with many different communities and understanding. I mean, yeah, it's just an incredible time to be alive. I think because of, we would never have met if the internet didn't exist. I mean, maybe we, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that it's an amazing thing that it's called the World Wide Web. Here we are.
Yeah.
Connected in and around so many different things. And I have to kind of process a lot of what you're saying, but I think it's really interesting that this whole communal sense in which we are one. Well, and I think back to what you've been talking about, this whole idea of what God is doing, pulling everything together. And so much of what we are experiencing in culture is this hardcore tribalism, which is pulling everything apart. Instead of recognizing there is no us and them, we are all in this together. And that's why we're commanded to love everyone, love our enemies. And that's just, everyone is an object of our love and everyone's an object of God's love. How that works out on the ground is something that's what we're learning from one another.
On this theme of community here, you're absolutely right, Tim, that the World Wide Web connects people and we can form some kind of community in that way. But in the way we've been defining community, community involves communal practice, and you can't really be involved in shared practice over the internet. So really, when I think of community in its proper sense, it actually means a physical community of people who are living together and sharing each other's lives. And you were just wondering, Paul, whether there are such communities around, and I'm sure they're, but sadly, few and far between. But I've come across one grouping or network of groupings called the Bruderhof communities. Have you heard of those?
Yeah.
There are quite a few in the States, and they're unisex live-in communities where you do have to sign up to a set of ground rules. One of them is you have to renounce personal possessions. It is a Christian community, and they model their community life, and this is why I'm mentioning this really here, on the Sermon on the Mount. It has Mennonite connections, this network. They're all over the world. I think this is quite relevant to our discussion because the Sermon on the Mount has been thought of as some kind of ideal that is unattainable. It cannot be lived out in this world. It's for the kingdom to come. But the Bruderhof community believe that that is not the case, that Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount as something that is meant to be lived out in the here and now, and that actually can be. And they're quite strong on this. One question that comes to mind is whenever you engage in practice, there's the danger of it becoming the expression of do's and don'ts. So
Yes.
law comes in very soon after you
Right.
start the practice. So my question is, how do you stop the practice from slipping into the law, which of course is the antithesis of what we're actually aiming for?
That's a wonderful question. Tim, you could probably speak a little bit. I don't know that much about the Bruderhof, but of course, a part of the division that we're talking about is between the Anabaptists, what becomes the Amish, the Mennonites. The thing that they are rediscovering, as you're pointing out, is practices and the Sermon on the Mount. You understand that among many Protestants, quite literally, and among Catholics, the Sermon on the Mount is not meant for practice. It's meant for, otherworldly or special priests. But I think, what the Mennonite, the Amish are rediscovering is the centrality of imitating Christ. This sounds like such a simple idea, but I think it, in fact, got lost in Lutheranism and Calvinism. The Amish preserve it. And of course, then the other thing that you're saying, the key question, and I think that Amish and Mennonite have failed in, at least the Amish that I'm surrounded by. I'm the outer part of this place I'm at happens to also be Amish. And these are Amish that are caught up in the do's and don'ts of the law. You can, so depending on your bishop, well, maybe you can use an engine or you can ride in a car, but you can't drive a car. You can use a cell phone, but you can't own a cell phone. Some Amish bishops allow you to smoke, others don't. It has become a terrible kind of legalism, unfortunately. And so I just happen to think that the tendency is always to fall back into forms of legalism. And if we can't get straight on the nature of the problem, I'm afraid, and I think that's part of the issue here, for many of us, we don't have in sight that that is precisely the problem, that we've taken the law, and the law can function. We've spread it out, and we've talked about it in many forms. We just do it again. This is the problem with our big Anglican churches or Episcopalian churches or, the traditional mainline churches. They've just taken the hierarchy and the structure, they've reified it, And that's the thing. I'm not criticizing anybody. If you can find fellowship in those churches, that's great. Go where you need to go to find fellowship. But I think we should be very careful on understanding the thing that is being described for us is in fact not a kind of top-down hierarchy, but it is this brotherhood, a fellowship, brother and sisterhood in Christ, in which there is not a authoritarian kind of hierarchy. Unfortunately, the Mennonites have also then, and the Amish. But Tim, you can probably speak to that better than I can.
Actually, the sad thing here is we're right in the heart of the Bible Belt, which is the Mennonite enclave. And I actually went to a Mennonite school, but it's interesting because they've become so commercially successful. The capitalism, I've had actually a friend took me up for my birthday on Saturday. He's part of the church. And I mean, we're just dropping another 30 million building another sanctuary because we can't contain everybody. And, so they're very much caught up with this huge church growth movement. And, they're taking over other churches. And, it's kind of sickening because, again, it's missing so much of the, what's going on the ground. But we also have, are you familiar with a group called the Hutterites? Is that term? They're more in the prairies here. And same sort of thing. They're very much like the Amish. They don't have such a problem with technology, though. And they live, again, in these huge communities. And I've always, the thing Simon was mentioning about, giving up their possessions, I've always wanted to start a community where everybody gives me their possessions and then they join and we get a compound somewhere. I think it's a great idea, Well, just, and to carry on with it, I was thinking of that wonderful quote, though, by Groucho Marx. I would never join a club that would allow me to be a member. So there's my cynicism. If they think I should be allowed to join them, there's something wrong with them.
Yeah. Simon, are you familiar with John Howard Yoder?
In a small way. I mean, I haven't read his book. What's it called? The Politics of Jesus. I haven't actually read that, although it's on my list. I read one called 7 Practices for Christian Practice in Community. Exactly what we're talking about. And now I can't quite get the title of the book. But yeah, so I read a small book by him.
And of course, people have stopped referencing John Howard Yoder because of his story. In other words, here is a Mennonite theologian. Stanley Hauerwas is shaped by John Howard Yoder in Hauerwas's own telling of it. Yoder is, I think, quite brilliant. And yet Yoder, this is the sad part of the story, Simon, and this is why I'm I'm with Tim on this. Yoder, it ends up, was engaging in illicit activities, not with one woman or two, but with hundreds. Mm. And he had formalized, he had a system all worked out. Oh, is that Yoder's Body Politics?
But yeah, that's the one I read. Yes.
He is advocating practices, but then he falls into the same trap, I'm afraid. The
same with Jean Vanier. I don't know whether you've heard of him. His writing is absolutely fantastic. It's just such a shame. And I struggle with whether his writing is invalidated by his actions. But it would seem that you don't think that Yoder's writing is invalidated by the way he lived his life.
What I've done with Yoder, I just happen to think that I can trace in Yoder not simply where he went wrong morally. He took this to such extremes that I think you can almost trace doctrinally. And I do that in a couple of blogs I try to show. Maybe because my project, you might say, well, wait a minute. And this is, I can hear my own daughter criticizing me here. Because my presumption is, and maybe my presumption is wrong, that right belief and right practice do and should go together. And I'm not saying, if we get the right belief, the right practice automatically follows. But I do think that wrong belief will show itself in a set of practices that are harmful to people. And so I just happen to think that we can trace a failure of practice. I think it usually is probably reflected in a theological understanding. And so I do that with Yoder. I said, he had some brilliant ideas, and we need to take some of his ideas, not just throw him out, which is more or less what's happened. I don't know that the Mennonites even talk about Yoder anymore. And it is on this issue of falling into a kind of, I think perverse sexuality just is one of the first things that crops up. And this is very Girardian. In other words, a kind of perverse desire. As I've described it, I think desire is already deceived in the way that we experience human desire. That's partly what's being deconstructed in Christianity, is we need to get at the heart of human desire and understand how it's functioning. And I don't think Yoder took it far enough. In other words, I don't think Yoder was able to do that with himself. Clearly, there's a moral failure there, but I think the moral failure is connected to the doctrinal failure.
I think on that too, Paul. Sometimes we always we're taught from, it's all about character, but sometimes competence can override character. Some of the most heinous people in the world had some good practices. And I'm loath to even mention some of them, but it does happen. As we like to say, even a broken clock is right twice a day. So I can, because there's things we certainly can learn. But my gosh, it's incredible when you think of the last 50 years, though, just the littering of the landscape. I was thinking, I don't know about you, but I was brought up in the Bill Gothard, in basic Christian institute.
Absolutely.
He was also outed. You know what I mean? It's mind-boggling, isn't it? And and then just recently the International House of Prayer, Mike Bickle, same thing, just virtually loved and revered by hundreds of thousands. And again, multiple sexual indiscretions. It just seems a mighty fall.
I've written about this in a perverse fashion, and I've divided up the way that the sexual failures. In other words, I think you can almost categorize the sexual failures by the particular group, right? I know this is, but I'm doing this from a kind of psychoanalytic understanding. What do we get in Roman Catholicism? Well, we all know pedophilia. So that it's almost like a manufacturing of pedophiles. Why pedophilia? Well, you could go through and actually there is a kind of, there's a reason there. What is the worst of sins? Well, it would be to have, commit adultery. But as Zizek puts it in his obscene way, but you can have all the little boys you want. Fundamentalism, go back to the Jimmy Swaggart. Fundamentalism, the very thing that is rejected becomes the shaping force. If you're thinking of a lie, the structure of the lie is the hidden aspect to it. And so, what is Jimmy Swaggart doing? Well, he's hiring prostitutes and, but he's doing it. It's not a very happy sex that these people are doing. It's sort of like Jerry Falwell Jr., that it's almost unsexual. It's almost, it's a perverse sexuality. Same thing with Bill Gothard. He commits himself to being single. And so my point with it is there is a structuring of desire in and through what is denied, rejected. It's not dealt with, and that becomes the force. So we got fundamentalism, we've got evangelicalism is characterized by a particular perverse sexuality. And maybe that's just because we're all failed, and the way in which we're failed tends to be sexuality. I do think this can once again be traced to a doctrinal understanding, that there is a failure of thought. There is a kind of desire is never dealt with, and the way that it's structured, that's what we're dealing with.
Well, that makes me realize that the thing that you rally, you're railing against and you're all angry with, and again, that very famous guy who was very anti-homosexual in Colorado, he was actually the president of the Evangelical Theological. Yes, that's right. So this is motive. I'm going to start rallying, yelling and screaming against capitalism because it's so horrible. I think I might end up becoming really rich.
Yeah,
and
we all feel it. Yeah. We all feel it, you know. I was actually, I've used up my time today, but I did a whole article on capitalism. McCare has written about the enchantments of mammon. And he's claiming, you know, that you got with Max Weber is claiming that capitalism is a disenchanting sort of, you know, the rise of capitalism with Protestantism. And then, you know, Protestantism is a kind of disenchantment. McCare is making it the opposite argument. He's saying that we've done with mammon what was formerly done with, you know, ghosts and religion, that just the power of money has been invested with a kind of animating, glorious kind of force that is the new enchantment. Mammon is the enchantment that I think we're probably all, maybe the most powerful religious enchantment of the age. Matt, welcome.
What did I miss?
I don't know why we got onto it. It certainly was not in my plan, but we got to talking about perverse sexuality.
Oh, shocking. What else do you guys talk about?
Money.
Money. You guys are down here talking about money and sexual perversion. Wow.
Money, sex, and power, and how to have all three. I think that was the title.
We begin.
Oh, man, I'm sorry that I missed it.
Yeah, we begin. Tim brought up the Yale School, George Lindbeck, Hauerwas, and McClendon, which is exactly spot on to this week, because what they're describing is, in other words, we're not doing propositionalism anymore. We've passed beyond a kind of propositionalism is, I think, tied into modernity, believing this set of things. But I think what the Yale School has captured, and McClendon then carried out most completely, or Hauerwas, they're both describing then communities of practice and a narrative theology. That is that lived out practice that I think we're describing is a failure in these perverse, you know, first of all, I think in evangelicalism, what has taken place? Well, it is the church growth movement that you're describing. What is the church growth movement? I think it is a giving in to the enchantments of desire that then naturally, you know, you want to cash in on the power. And one of the ways of cashing in on power is women. I mean, to put it crudely, is in and through perverse sexuality. Or, you know, in a kind of fundamentalism, Ted Haggard, yeah, I'm the chief of sinners, and that, you know, who needs saving more than me? In other words, is in his very description how he could be preaching against this and practicing it at the same time. There's a separation between his faith and his practice. His soul gets saved, and it's almost like the more he sins, you know, it's almost like following Paul's rule, shall I sin that grace may abound? I think Ted Haggard would say, yeah, and was putting into play. So I think this is evangelicalism in as much as it's caught up in a kind of Calvinism. There is this, you know, faith and practice, faith and works are in a sense opposed to one another almost. And you demonstrate grace in and through your human failure. The greater a sinner I am, the more grace I have. And Ted Haggard almost broke it down that way in his he went on, you know, national media and explained his theology and didn't seem too bothered. You got to feel sorry for these guys, because it's not like they got a handle on they've been gripped by something that they themselves, they can't figure it out. I think that's what we're describing. So it's not like these guys are evil wizards or something, you know, completely manipulative. I think they're just sucked into something that they don't know what has a hold of it. And so that's the idolatry section of this.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.